The drunk's daughter was shamed in chains until a rancher stepped forward. The drunkard's daughter was tied to the post in the center of Dry Creek's Market Square, her wrists bound in rough rope that dug into her skin until it burned red. The late spring sun of 1873 beat down without mercy, turning every clay rooftop into a skillet and every wooden plank into a mirror that threw back the light. Townsfolk gathered not with pity, but with that strange mixture of fascination and cruelty that only grows stronger when the heat wears on nerves. They had seen fights, brawls, even a hanging or two, but there was something more intoxicating about public shame. Clara Dalton kept her back straight, though her knees wavered under the weight of the day. Sweat ran down her cheeks, dust sticking to her skin like a second punishment. She said nothing, met no one's eye as whispers and barbed remarks swirled around her. "She's just like her daddy," muttered a woman with folded arms. Another leaned in and added, "Henry Dalton never met a bottle he couldn't smash, and half the time it was over someone's head. Now his girl carries the same blood." A grocer's wife lifted her chin and declared she owes for flour fat back, even cough syrup, and she still walks around as though debt isn't carved into her name. A man near the well spat on the ground, shaking his head. "Her old man broke my window with a whiskey bottle last winter. Nobody helped me then, so why should I lift a hand for her? Let her stand there till the sun drops." And the crowd nodded, because in towns like Dry Creek, judgment was easier than compassion and cruelty easier still. The square fell momentarily quiet as Reverend Pike climbed the steps of the stone well, Bible raised like a sword. His voice rolled heavy and sharp. "Sin must be laid bare, so the soul may be cleansed. A town that excuses corruption will rot from the inside. This girl may dress herself in silence, but silence hides guilt. We will not let pity cloud our judgment." He gestured toward Clara like a prosecutor summing up a case. "She is the daughter of Henry Dalton, a drunkard who poisoned wells, ruined medicine, and left his neighbors poorer for his follies. Blood carries sin, and the price must be paid." Clara stood motionless, her eyes hollow but not broken. She had once dreamed of teaching children their letters of chalkboards and ink-stained fingers, but no one remembered that. They remembered only debts she had tried to pay, and failed the bottles she never lifted but still carried as if they hung from her shoulders. She had stitched her father's coat late into countless nights, patched roofs, scrubbed floors, even taught ranch hands' children how to read, but all of it was invisible against the shadow of Henry Dalton. As the sun rose higher, most of the crowd drifted toward shade, but their eyes never strayed far. Some sought entertainment in watching her flinch, though she never gave them the satisfaction. Others clung to a strange belief that public scorn was righteous, that tying a woman to a post could cleanse a town of shame it never wanted to admit was its own. Then, from the road at the square's edge, a figure appeared. At first, no one paid him much attention. He was tall and spare, wearing a weather-worn duster boots, heavy with dust from miles of trail. His name was Samuel Carter, though many in town barely remembered it. He lived on the far edge of the canyon lands where only wind and coyotes kept company. A widower of 5 winters, he rarely spoke, and if he did, it was usually to a horse rather than a man. But on this day, his silence carried weight. He walked with an unhurried step, his presence like the stillness that comes before a storm. The townsfolk murmured uneasy now as he stopped a few feet from Clara. He studied her face the way one studies a wounded colt, measuring careful, not with pity, but with a calm assessment. From his sack, Samuel withdrew a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth still warm. He carried it not like a man carrying food, but like a man carrying something sacred. With slow, deliberate steps, he crossed the space between himself and Clara. Dust rose around his boots. A hush fell as though even the cicadas held their breath. Without a word, Samuel placed the bread on Clara's lap, his motion so gentle it felt like he was setting down a newborn child. Then he moved behind her fingers, working steadily at the knots in the rope. No one dared to stop him. The rope slid free, dropping to the ground with a weightless thud. Clara did not move. She did not even breathe. Samuel stepped back, eyes never leaving hers. Still, he said nothing, and then, just as calmly as he had arrived, he turned and walked away. Not hurried, not ashamed, not fearful, simply finished. The square erupted not in shouts, but in sharp whispers that spread like prairie fire. What in God's name was that someone hissed? He gave her bread like she deserved kindness. Another shook his head. Has he lost his mind? Reverend Pike gripped his Bible tighter, but his tongue faltered. He found no verse quick enough to condemn what he had just seen. Clara looked down at the loaf in her lap, her wrists raw from rope burns. Her hands trembled but did not reach for it. Her face betrayed nothing but the faintest flicker in her eyes, like the first crack of light through stone. A crack so small it might have been imagination, yet enough to unseat the certainty of a whole town. That evening, long after the crowd dispersed, whispers still clung to the streets of Dry Creek. Some called it rebellion, others called it madness, but no one, not the preacher, not the grocer's wife, not even the men who had spat on the dirt, could erase the image from their minds, a shamed girl freed not by plea or power, but by a loaf of bread placed in her lap as if it belonged there. The town would talk of it for weeks, but Clara carried the moment in silence the way she had carried everything else. Her wrists throbbed as she walked back toward the edge of the prairie, but there was something else now, something harder to name. Not forgiveness, not hope, but the faintest sense that silence could be more than resignation. It could be defiance. And as the sun dropped behind the ridges, she stepped into the long shadows, the taste of dust in her mouth, the weight of bread still warm against her dress. Clara's legs carried her home by instinct, though every step burned from the raw rope marks across her wrists. The cabin leaned against the prairie wind like an old man too tired to stand straight. Its boards were gray with rot, its roof patched in so many places it resembled a quilt. She pushed the door open and was met by the stale mixture of smoke, sweat, and cheap liquor. Her father, Henry Dalton, sprawled across the cot, one arm dangling to the dirt floor, his mouth slack. An empty tin cup lay overturned sticky with the last drops of rot-gut whiskey he had bartered for. God knew what. His snores rasped like sandpaper. Clara lit the oil lamp with a trembling hand, the flame flickering weakly against walls that had once been whitewashed but now carried only stains. This was her inheritance, 4 crumbling walls and debts that multiplied faster than she could ever pay. She dipped a rag into a basin of cool water and scrubbed the rope burns from her wrists. Blood smeared the cloth, and she worked until the skin was raw but clean. No tears came. There hadn't been tears in years. The next morning brought more of the same. Clara patched leaks with torn feed sacks, boiled scraps of turnip, with a bone too old to hold flavor, and stacked kindling until her back ached. Her dreams of teaching children had long since faded like the ink of her school books, now hidden beneath a floorboard where mice couldn't reach, but time still could. Then, without warning, something shifted. After a night of storm, she woke to find shingles nailed neatly onto the roof, mismatched, but strong, fastened by a hand that knew the work. She stepped outside the damp grass, cool beneath her bare feet, and saw the careful knots holding down a tarp. She touched one, and recognition struck it was tied the same way Samuel Carter had loosened her bonds in the square. Later that day, a sack of potatoes rested on her window ledge. No note, no sound of hoofbeats, just the quiet generosity of a man who left without needing to be thanked. Clara's hands lingered on the sack longer than necessary. She whispered nothing, but inside her chest something began to stir as fragile as a bird's first flutter. 3 days later, the well crank, rusted stiff for years, turned easily in her hand. Clear water spilled into the bucket. She nearly cried, but stopped herself because crying felt dangerous, like weakness the world would seize upon. Instead, that evening she scrubbed an old kettle until it gleamed and set it on the porch beside a chipped enamel cup. Beneath it, she tucked a small note. "If you ever return, there will be hot water." The kettle remained untouched for days, and she scolded herself for the foolishness of hope. But on the 4th morning, the cup had moved. The kettle was empty. She stepped onto the porch with her heart hammering as though she had run a mile. At twilight, she finally saw him, Samuel, sitting at the sagging fence of her garden. He held nothing, said nothing. Clara poured 2 cups of tea steeped with river mint and dandelion and carried one to him. He accepted it without hesitation, nodding, once his expression unreadable. They sat side by side as the prairie glowed gold under the setting sun. He did not speak of the town, and she did not speak of shame. The silence stretched not empty, but full of something unspoken. When she glanced at him, she saw not pity in his face, but a stillness that felt like respect. For the first time in months, her back loosened, her chest expanded without pain. When the tea was gone, Samuel stood nodded again and walked away into the dusk. Clara whispered to the wind, "You don't have to speak to be heard." And for once, silence did not feel like loneliness. It felt like peace. But Dry Creek was not a place that forgave easily. By midsummer, Clara walked its streets with her head-high basket on her arm, but the whispers clung to her like flies. "There she goes, acting like she belongs," muttered one. "She never answered for what her daddy did," hissed another. On the church steps, Reverend Pike sharpened his tongue once again. "A woman who walks in shadows walks with shadows. Mercy is not blindness." Clara ignored him. She had learned silence could wound sharper than words. But the town was not done testing her. Near the apothecary, a boy no older than 8 broke free from his mother's grip, ran up and spit at her boots. The wet slap froze her in place. Gasps followed. Clara met the boy's eyes, defiant, proud. Then a shadow moved between them. Samuel stood tall and unshaken. The boy blinked uncertain now. Samuel crouched, plucked a wildflower from between the planks of the boardwalk and placed it in the child's hand. The boy stared confused as his mother pulled him away with a hiss of scolding. Samuel remained kneeling. He reached into his pocket, drew out a worn handkerchief stitched with a faded letter, and wiped the spit from Clara's boot. Her throat tightened. She opened her mouth to speak, but he shook his head. There was no shame in his touch, only reverence. He rose slowly, nodded once, and walked away. Clara stood rooted, the flower crushed under her heel, her eyes burning not with insult, but with something harder to contain. That night, she baked a small loaf of cornbread and left it on her windowsill. Inside, she tucked a note, "I am not worthy of your kindness, but I remember it." The next morning, a new gate stood at the entrance of her yard. Pine wood sanded smooth hinges that didn't creak. No name carved, no signature left, but the message was clear. It was a gate meant to stay closed against judgment. Clara laid her hands on the wood, rough yet warm, and felt the tremor of gratitude surge through her. She did not speak of it aloud. She had no need. When she sat on the porch with her tea that night, she waited, but Samuel did not appear. Still, she understood. The silence between them had grown into something else entirely, something that neither sermon nor gossip could erase. The town might keep its whispers, but Clara had begun to discover a truth she had never dared believe, that kindness once planted could grow in the hardest soil. The days stretched long beneath the summer heat, and Clara began to notice small signs of Samuel's presence even when he wasn't there. A loosened hinge on the back door closed softly now. The handle of the well bucket no longer bit into her palms mended with fresh leather. A coil of rope left near her porch bore the same tidy knot she had come to recognize. His care arrived like rain on parched soil, quiet, steady, life-giving. Clara responded in her own way. She baked bread when she could spare the flour cornbread, mostly coarse but warm, and left it where she knew he would find it on the sill near the fence line, sometimes tucked inside a folded cloth. Once she even added a note written in her careful teacher's hand. "You give without asking. I can only return what I can." Though the town still whispered and hissed, Clara no longer bent beneath its weight. She began teaching again, not in a schoolhouse, but under the great elm tree near her porch. At first, only 3 children came shy and barefoot, clutching pebbles and sticks for counting. Then more arrived 2 sisters from a ranch east of the creek, a boy whose father worked the blacksmith's forge. Clara used whatever she had, buttons as token scraps of paper, as spelling boards, her own voice as a book. She asked for no payment, only their attention. The townsfolk muttered. Who does she think she is teaching children, as though her father's sins weren't carved into her name? But their complaints did little. The children kept coming, and laughter returned to Clara's yard in bursts of spelling lessons and mispronounced words. One afternoon, after sending the children home, Clara discovered a bundle waiting beneath the elm. Chalk slate boards neatly wrapped in canvas. Her breath caught as she traced the rough handwriting on the tag, "For lessons that matter." She didn't need to guess who left it. Life found rhythm in these unspoken exchanges. Clara read from her worn books in the evenings, and Samuel fixed fences or sharpened tools. She stitched clothes, patched the garden rows, and boiled beans. He built a stronger trough for her water and left bundles of firewood stacked neatly outside her door. Their lives ran in parallel, never colliding but never apart. It wasn't until late summer that the silence between them bent into something deeper. One stormy night, Clara sought an extra blanket in the back room of Samuel's cabin, where he had given her shelter after a long day working his ranch. There, tucked inside a cracked frame, she found a photograph, faded edges worn. The woman in it was not beautiful in the polished sense, but unforgettable hair, braided tight arms, crossed eyes blazing with defiance. Clara held the picture gently as if it might crumble. She understood immediately. When Samuel returned, drenched from searching for a stray calf, she handed him a towel soup warm in the pot. "Your wife?" she asked softly. He paused, spoon halfway to his lips. His eyes flickered with the weight of memory. "She never backed down," he said finally. "She died with her boots on." Clara reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on his. "Then you saved me because you knew what it meant. Not because I was helpless." Samuel said nothing, but in that silence trust rooted itself like a seed pressing into soil. The peace did not last long. Dry Creek's judgment still festered. One night, when the sky boiled with thunderclouds, the townsfolk came. Their voices rose before the first torchlight flared. "This town does not forget," one man shouted. Another jeered, "She acts like a saint, teaching our children lies." Then glass shattered. A rock smashed through Clara's window. Flames licked at the curtains. Clara fought with frantic hands, smothering fire with a blanket, choking on smoke that seared her lungs. She screamed into the night, "I am not my father," but no one listened. Another torch hit the wall. Boards crackled, flames spreading. Her hands bled from broken glass as she staggered outside, rain slashing across her face. Hoofbeats thundered through the storm. Out of the firelight, Samuel appeared, rain streaming from his coat eyes hard as steel. He leapt from his horse, wrapped his coat around Clara's shoulders, and without a word lifted her into his arms. She clung to him, coughing against his chest as he carried her clear of the collapsing roof. Behind them, her cabin fell with a groan, flames roaring into the storm. Sparks shot into the night sky before the rain smothered them. Samuel placed her gently onto the saddle, swung up behind her, and spurred his horse into the darkness. Clara buried her face against him, every muscle trembling, every breath a struggle. He never looked back. They rode until the glow of fire faded, until the storm broke into silence. Samuel's ranch lay at the far edge of Red Rock country, where mesas rose like guardians, and the night sky burned with stars too bright for judgment. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices neither fearful nor hungry, but wild and free. When Clara woke the next morning, she lay in a cot beside a window washed with dawn light. The cabin was modest, bare, but whole walls, straight roof, tight boards swept clean. Nothing sagged or stank of liquor. The silence here was not condemning. It was patient. It waited for her, not against her. Outside, the steady thump of an axe carried through the valley. She stepped to the door and saw Samuel working at the woodpile, sleeves rolled hair damp with morning mist. He did not greet her. He did not ask how she had slept. He simply handed her a pair of gloves and pointed toward the northern fence line. For the first time in her life, Clara felt the weight of shame begin to lift. Not because it vanished, but because she had found someone willing to stand in it with her. Samuel's silence was not judgment, it was recognition. And when she pulled those gloves over her blistered hands, she knew she had stepped into a new chapter of her life, one that no town whisper could take from her. The first weeks at Samuel's ranch passed in a rhythm that surprised Clara. Morning light spilled over the mesas, painting the land in amber, and Samuel was always awake before the sun, his axe or hammer already moving. Clara rose with him, though her body was not used to such labor. By noon, her shoulders burned and her palms blistered, but she matched his pace post for post, wire for wire. He never praised her with words, but once when she lifted the final post into place, Samuel gave a single nod. It was small, nearly imperceptible, but it warmed her more than any sermon she had ever endured. That evening, they shared beans and cornbread in near silence. When he passed her the butter, their fingers brushed. It was nothing, and it was everything. Their lives twined like strands of rope, separate fibers, strong on their own, yet stronger together. Clara fed the horses, patched water barrels, planted onions and squash in the garden. Samuel sharpened tools, built a new gate for the barn-mended fences across the ridges. At dusk, they sat side by side with tin mugs, watching the sun bleed fire across the sky. Sometimes they spoke brief words about weather or fences. More often, they sat quietly, and the silence between them grew softer, fuller, something neither of them needed to explain. Still, Clara felt the pull of his grief. She noticed how he kept a second cot across the cabin sheets folded neatly each morning, pillow dented only once. She caught him watching her hands as she braided rope or her figure as she walked between rows of squash, not with hunger but with memory. The photograph of his wife remained on the shelf-dusted clean eyes, fierce even through fading ink. Clara did not ask about it again. She did not need to. She understood that Samuel had not saved her out of pity. He had recognized in her the same fire he once loved a fire beaten but unextinguished. By autumn, Clara's lessons beneath the elm tree had grown. A dozen children came now barefoot, laughing, their voices scattering through the valley like birdsong. Samuel built simple desks from pine, setting them out in rows beneath the shade. Clara taught letters in the dirt numbers with stones, stories from her books read aloud with steady cadence. The children adored her, and their parents, though cautious, began to allow it. A few even lingered to listen. It was the first time in years Clara felt her purpose return whole. But Dry Creek's leaders did not forget. They waited until the ranch showed signs of prosperity. New fences, healthy crops, laughter where silence had been. Then, one afternoon, a carriage groaned to a stop at the edge of Samuel's yard. Clara stood on the porch steps with a basket of onions in her arms. Her breath caught when she saw who descended. Reverend Pike, sharp-shouldered spectacles, glinting Bible clutched like a blade. Beside him came Mayor Whitmore, heavy and slow, leaning on a cane that looked more weapon than crutch. Their faces were carved with disdain, framed by the dust of their journey. Samuel appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He did not rush. He did not bow. He simply stood broad and steady, his face unreadable. Whitmore spoke first. "Mr. Carter, we've observed your prosperity. It has raised concern." His voice dripped with practiced authority. Reverend Pike stepped forward, eyes narrowed. "This woman, Clara Dalton, carries not only her father's sins, but her own silence. Her presence here unsettles the moral balance of our town. To harbor her is to harbor corruption." Clara's grip on the basket tightened until her fingers burned. She did not move. She did not flinch. Whitmore continued. "We ask formally that you remove her from your property. If you refuse, proceedings will begin to reclaim this land under the Charter's moral clause." His words landed heavy, as though law and righteousness belonged only to him. Samuel said nothing. Instead, he raised one hand palm outward and motioned for the men to follow him. Confused, but too proud to question, they trailed him around the side of the house. Clara remained rooted to the porch, her breath shallow. Samuel led them to the back gate, a tall arch framed with wagon wheels and iron hinges. He opened it, slowly gestured for them to step through, and as soon as they did, he pulled it closed with a thud that echoed like a hammer on stone. The latch clicked. The mayor turned, lips parted in protest, but Samuel raised his hand again, calm, final. No words needed. He walked back to the porch and stood beside Clara as the carriage rattled away, its wheels kicking up more noise than it had brought. They said nothing, but Clara's heart hammered. In that single motion, Samuel had drawn a line between them and the town. And for the first time in her life, she felt someone choose her without hesitation. That night, the wind picked up, sighing through the cracks of the cabin, dragging scraps of hay across the yard. Clara sat by the hearth hands, wrapped around a tin cup, staring into the tea as though it held answers she could not name. Samuel crouched beside her, not touching, not speaking, but present his steadiness like the foundation of a house in storm season. After midnight, she rose and walked toward the barn. Samuel saddled the horse without asking why. He lifted her onto it, swung up behind her, and together they rode into the star-strewn night. The silence stretched for miles until Samuel reined the horse and pointed to the sky. I would lose the land. I would lose every ounce of respect. I would lose everything, he said, his voice low but certain. Then he turned to her. But don't you ever believe you are not worthy of this. Clara said nothing. She only rested her head against him as they turned back toward the ranch. The stars burned above indifferent, but beneath them 2 people no longer measured themselves by the town's shadow. When they returned, Clara lay awake for hours listening to the wind through the eaves. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. The town would not stop. Judgment never did. But something stronger had taken root, quiet, steady, unshakable. And it lived not in words, but in the simple acts of a man who had once laid bread on her lap and freed her hands from rope. The mist rolled into the valley one dawn, pale silver that wrapped the ranch in a hush. Clara stood in the doorway, with her shawl pulled tight, a small satchel at her feet. She had slept little, torn between fear and gratitude, unsure if she belonged in a place that had given her so much. Samuel slept soundly in the next room, unaware. She left without waking him. Inside, on the wooden kitchen table, she placed 2 things, a handkerchief stitched in uneven thread with his name, and a loaf of bread still warm from her hands. Its crust was split imperfect, but it carried the weight of everything she had once feared: acceptance, hope, belonging. Beneath it, she left a folded note, 5 words written in her careful hand: "The bread I once feared." Then she stepped off the porch into the mist following the trail until the ranch faded behind her. By midday, the fog lifted. Samuel returned from the barn to find the cabin too quiet, the hearth cold. His eyes caught the bread on the table, the handkerchief beside it. He read the note, once folded it carefully into his coat pocket, as though it were scripture, and saddled his horse without hesitation. He rode northwest across the meadow toward the one place he knew she would go. He found her beneath the crooked oak that leaned over the bluff, its branches twisted as if listening to the earth's secrets. Clara sat with her knees drawn up, her eyes distant but dry. She did not look surprised when he dismounted. She had heard his horse, felt his presence before she saw him. Samuel walked toward her, extended his hand. Clara hesitated only a breath, then placed her fingers in his. Their hands closed together, uncertain at first, then sure. No words passed between them. They didn't need them. Together, they walked back to the ranch, the horse trailing behind. By dusk, they reached the gate. The same gate Samuel had once closed against the preacher and mayor still bore scorch marks, but it stood firm. Clara stepped through first. A week later, the pasture filled with mismatched chairs borrowed from neighbors. There was no preacher, no choir, no ribbons of lace, but children Clara had taught sat in the front row, their eyes wide with excitement. Neighbors who once whispered now watched quietly. Clara wore a muslin dress she had sewn herself, hair pinned neatly back. Samuel stood beside her in his only white shirt, worn on Sundays and little else. They exchanged no rehearsed vows. No blessings came from pulpit or law. Samuel slid a ring onto her finger crafted from a melted coin hammered smooth. Clara gave him one made from a loop of wire cut from his first fence. Their words were few, but Samuel's voice carried steady, "You will never stand alone again." When they kissed, it was soft, hesitant, and wholly real. The wind swept across the pasture as though sealing the promise. No law recognized it, no charter recorded it, but something older than paper or ink blessed the Union choice effort and the will to begin again. Years passed and the ranch grew louder. Laughter rang through the fields where silence once held sway. Small voices spelled words, chased chickens, hammered crooked nails into planks. Samuel cut for them. Clara sat beneath the porch awning, chalk in one hand, book in the other, teaching letters on a propped-up board. Samuel showed older children how to mend saddles, care for horses, and read the sky before storms. The ranch became a haven not just for them but for wanderers, widows, and children with no place else to go. Above the doorway, Clara stitched a sign onto linen home, not judged. It hung there for all to see, a simple truth woven by her own hands. No one asked where it came from. No one needed to. Each week, a loaf of bread appeared on the windowsill. Sometimes sweet, sometimes plain, always warm. No one ever saw who left it, but its meaning was clear. Bread still mattered. It had begun everything. One spring morning, dew still on the grass, Samuel turned from the barn to see a little girl running barefoot toward him, curls flying arms wide. He bent, catching her with a soft grunt, lifting her high against his chest as she laughed into his shirt. Clara stood in the doorway, hair loose from braids, flour dusting her hands from kneading that morning's bread. Her eyes shone with something she once thought lost forever. She whispered, not to Samuel, not to the child, but to herself, "I am your wife now, not just in grief, but in living." The wind lifted the edge of the linen sign as if to agree. The woman, once tied to a market post, now stood behind her own doorframe, holding together a home, not with coin or reputation, but with work will and the steadfast love of a man who had offered her bread instead of pity. She was no longer just the drunkard's daughter. She was a teacher, a wife, a mother. She had become all three by accepting a love that spoke through actions when words had failed. Samuel never stopped carrying a loaf in his saddlebag just in case. To him, it was more than food. It was memory, rebellion, a promise. And perhaps that is a lesson worth carrying from their story. That kindness, offered quietly, can change the course of a life. That love is not proven by speeches or sermons, but by steady hands that build gates, mend roofs, and wipe shame from another's boots. That forgiveness is not forgetting the past, but choosing to stand beside someone despite it. If you've ever believed that the smallest gesture, a loaf of bread, a steady hand, a moment of silence could matter more than grand promises, then you understand what kept Clara and Samuel alive in the face of judgment. And maybe that is what our world still needs. Not perfect people, but people willing to act with decency when no one else will. People who choose love not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. So, if this story touched something in you, let it remind you, love does not ask permission, and hope does not beg forgiveness. It grows quietly in places no one expects, until one day it becomes strong enough to carry you home. If you believe that truth, share it in the comments below. Tell us what you think, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of second chances, where judgment falls silent, and love is the only voice left standing.